chapter on the muscular system. So in finishing up this chapter on the muscular system, what we've been doing is we've been working our way through the muscle tissue itself. And like we talked about, that's where we usually start. We start down at the smallest level, and then we can scale our way up to the larger levels. So we will certainly have a chapter where we're going through the different types of skeletal muscles and looking at their distribution and where do they connect and what's their particular action and things like that. But at this point, we're just trying to establish how this muscle tissue does its job by looking at the cells, etc. And remember, we've been focusing on skeletal muscle tissue, and in this last segment, hopefully the last segment, we should be finishing up with skeletal muscle in terms of its characteristics and its performance and things like that, and then moving on to smooth muscle. And then cardiac muscle, remember our third specific muscle type, will be considered mostly when we get to cardiovascular system in the second anatomy and physiology class. All right, so let's jump back into it. So one of the things that we keep talking about is how in the sliding filament mechanism, it's very important where we have these different molecules that are interacting to produce the actions that we see muscles and muscle cells being able to generate. And so when we are looking at it, one of the key molecules was ATP. So we saw as we hydrolyze ATP, then that allows the myosin head to disengage from the actin and gives it the energy to recock and be ready to go again. But then the question is, kind of where do we get this ATP? And in fact, it's going to be two of the ways that you already know from your general biology class. So it's going to be aerobic and anaerobic production of ATP. But then there's also going to be a third way as well. So let's take a look and see what these three mechanisms are. So this is the first one that is unique to skeletal muscle and the muscular tissue. It's direct phosphorylation of the ADP. Remember, that's adenosine diphosphate by creatine phosphate. Now you hear quite often these days about creatine, right? People that are taking creatine, and the idea is it gives them more energy to be able to weight lift and things like this. So what they are trying to do is give their body this substance which can potentially produce the additional phosphate that would then donate that phosphate to the ADP molecule in order to easily or more easily generate ATP. Now, question is how well that works and how much is too much, etc. All kinds of questions there. But in truth, physiologically, using creatine phosphate, this is one of the ways that we can quickly regenerate ATP. And now, like we said, the other two ways in terms of the anaerobic pathway, when we have glycolysis and then lactic acid formation, and then the aerobic pathway, right? So anaerobic is going to be if we don't have oxygen present, then what's going to happen is we're going to get a small amount of ATP produced, but we're not going to be able to go any further. And in fact, the product of our glycolysis, our acid, right? Pyruvic acid changes to lactic acid, and everybody's heard about the problems with lactic acid and muscle activity. But if oxygen is present, then those pyruvic acids will then be going into the next part of our cycle inside of the mitochondria, and that will involve what's called aerobic respiration. So we're assuming that you know those two parts. We will touch on them briefly, but the key thing we want to talk about a little bit then is going to be this first production of ATP that we maybe didn't know about previously. And it breaks down to, like we said, the creatine phosphate being a donator, if you will, where we're going to be able to donate a phosphate from the creatine phosphate and tag it on to ADP. And there's an enzyme called creatine kinase that helps to do that type of transfer. So this is kind of the reaction that we see down at the bottom here. Creatine phosphate, because it has that extra phosphate, we're going to add it on to the ADP. That takes us down to creatine and ATP. And this is our first burst of energy comes from this production of ATP. So powers the cell for about 15 seconds. So that's kind of an image of the chemical reaction that is going on. Now, anaerobic pathway, remember, doesn't require oxygen, occurs in the cytosol of the cell, and 2 ATPs are going to be produced for every 1 glucose molecule that is taken in. So, on a certain level, you're like, oh, well, that's not bad, right? You get 1 for 2. Now, I'd go to the casino with that, right? But what we find is that we get a big payoff in the aerobic production instead. So, like we said, in terms of this pathway, anaerobic pathway, it's going to end with the production of the pyruvic acid converting to lactic acid instead. So, what we ultimately find is that this way, anaerobic pathway, gives us a little bit more ATP, but it produces it faster. So if you need it quickly for short bursts of contractions, etc., then this is going to be okay. And so this is the idea here, right? So we see glucose, right? And we're going to get the production of 2 ATP, and that pyruvic acid is going to convert to lactic acid. All right, so now aerobic respiration, you'll remember, produces the bulk of our ATP during rest and what we call aerobic exercise, right? If you're going to go do aerobic exercise, or aerobics, they used to call it like in the 80s, then you are using your muscles, but not such a high level that you're outpacing their ability to produce ATP using aerobic respiration. So this is where we're really going to get long durations of production of ATP using aerobic respiration. And remember, this occurs in the mitochondria, and ultimately we get 32 ATP per glucose. Now we also get carbon dioxide being produced, and we use oxygen as a final electron acceptor. And so that's really why we have a respiratory system. And part of the reason why we have a circulatory system, right, is because we've got to get fresh loads of oxygen from the atmosphere, and we've got to distribute it to the cells so they can use that oxygen to produce ATP aerobically. But at the end of that process, we also put out carbon dioxide, kind of like a factory, if you will, and we have to get rid of that carbon dioxide using our respiratory system. But again, we'll talk more about that when we get into it in the second part of anatomy and physiology. So what we find is that, like we said, aerobic endurance is going to give us these long distance or long duration as well activities being possible as it's fueled by aerobic production of ATP. So when we look at our 3 different ways that we can produce ATP, right, there's going to be some ATP that can be stored in the muscles. That can be the first few seconds or so. Then when we get to the creatine phosphate, right, that takes us out to about 15 seconds or so. Then when we look at anaerobic respiration, then what we can do is we see that we can get that, you know, on, like we said, short duration but high intensity exercise. So a few minutes or something like that. But if you're going to do long duration exercise like you see on the right, 30 minutes, 20, 30 minutes, etc., then we have to get to aerobic respiration instead. Now, muscle fatigue, there's been a lot of research on muscle fatigue, and there's always been kind of questions as to what it comes from, whether it's the buildup of that lactic acid, etc., the change in pH and things like that, but it also may have to do with a change in the concentration of some of our different ions that are involved, like potassium in terms of repolarizing a cell, calcium as our intercellular messenger, phosphate as well. All these things can affect the performance of our muscle cells. And in fact, when we see that we are getting towards the end of our exercise and we are really fatigued, oftentimes you go into what was historically called oxygen debt. This is now called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. But basically, we need oxygen in order to convert the lactic acid back, in order to get oxygen to go back into aerobic respiration, get glycogen stores, storing our glucose as well, things like that. Okay, so let's continue on and see if we can move forward and finish up skeletal muscle and move into our other muscle types. So these are other things that can affect the performance of muscles. In this case, increasing the force instead of like the duration. We want to see how powerful they can be. And the contractile force will have to do with recruitment. We saw that before. Like we said, like the military, we recruit more individuals, more motor units. You're going to have a stronger force, right? Larger muscle fibers as well, right? So you hear about, you know, weightlifting and things like that, and the muscles get bigger. So that's going to affect the contractile force. The frequency of stimulation, remember, where we're going bzz, 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 and we're recruiting more and more and going into tetanus. And then also the length of the muscle. That is an effect that can have on its ability to contract. So that's an interesting thing. When we look here in this graph and we see along the x-axis the resting sarcomere or the resting muscle length, they're tied together, and the amount of tension that they can produce, what we find, here's 100. 100 is basically like a resting length sarcomere, a resting muscle. And if we look at 100, we can see that the optimal amount of tension that we can produce occurs at resting length. And if we get overstretched, and if the muscle is partially bunched, then you're going to get less. You see how that curve drops off on either side? To the right there, right? If the muscle is way overstretched, then remember that these myosin heads were almost like hands pulling on a rope. If we were talking about a tug of war, imagine if you just had your fingertips and you were trying to do that, right? You wouldn't have enough purchase to be able to pull as much as you could. So that's what happens when the muscle gets overstretched. It doesn't have as much power. And then also, if it's already partially shortened, then we don't have a lot of more of actin to pull on before we get to the end. So we're not going to be able to generate as much force as well. It's almost fully contracted. So for skeletal muscle, the optimal length for producing the most amount of tension is resting length, which makes sense, right? We'll see, even though that makes sense to us now, to be sure, we'll see that that is a little bit different when we get to smooth muscle. Okay, so talk about the force it can produce, how long it can act, how about how fast it can contract as well. So these things have to do with muscle fiber type, the load, and the recruitment. So the muscle fiber type, this is interesting because when we talk about muscle fibers, remember muscle fibers are muscle cells. So a muscle fiber and a muscle cell is the same thing. And in fact, there are different types of muscle cells. So there are two characteristics which get them classified. There are either fibers that are slow or fast twitch fibers, and there are fibers that are called oxidative or glycolytic, depending on how they use their ATP. So what we find is that the slow and fast fibers is basically those enzymes, the ATP aces, how fast they can split that ATP allows them to basically contract quickly or not, okay? And in terms of what pathways they use in order to generate that ATP, do they generate the ATP quickly using anaerobic pathways, or do they generate it slowly but through time in terms of aerobic pathways? So you can imagine different muscles around your body, ones that need to move very quickly, but not for long duration, as opposed to ones like your postural muscles or maybe your thigh muscles or something like that, where we need those to be able to work very long periods of time without getting fatigued. But we don't need them to move very quickly, right? So we don't need to have our postural muscles along our vertebral column contract very quickly. We don't need that. We're going to throw out our back or something like that, right? So they can move slowly, but they can also then, like the tortoise, they can go much longer as opposed to the hare, if you will, or the rabbit, which goes fast, but can only go short distances, right? Or short amounts of time. So as you can see, if we combine those characteristics, we get things like slow oxidative fibers, and we get fast glycolytic fibers, and then you get ones that are in the middle that are called fast oxidative fibers that are kind of like a hybrid. And so when we look at an individual muscle itself, it's usually made up of a mixture of fibers. It's not all one or the other or a middle one. It's a mixture of fibers, but it can be more dominated by one fiber type or another depending on the muscle's use and activity. Like we said, in terms of like our postural muscles that need to be mostly slow oxidative fibers, as opposed to like our biceps muscles or something like that that need to be fast glycolytic fibers. And it's a mix. And an interesting thing about this is when you look at these different fiber types, it will actually change the color of the fiber. The fiber will be a different color based on some of these characteristics. And like you see here, different types of muscles are better suited for different jobs, and so they have different fibers. But when we look at things like slow oxidative fibers, they have stores of ATP in a muscle molecule that is called myo. My M is getting myo, right? Remember that means muscle? Globin. So myoglobin is like hemoglobin. Hemoglobin occurs in the blood and it binds oxygen and it releases as necessary. Myoglobin is a protein that occurs in muscle fibers like slow oxidative fibers, and it holds on to ATP and gives it to them as necessary. So the more myoglobin you have, like the more hemoglobin you have, the redder, the darker those muscle fibers are. And if you're talking about our fast twitch fibers, which are getting it from, like anaerobic respiration, they have less myoglobin in them, so they appear more pale. Now, when we think about it, think about if you are at Thanksgiving or something like that, and all the turkey meat's laid out. There's dark meat and there's white meat, right? The dark meat, where's the dark meat found in turkey? Like on the legs, right? Legs, thighs, etc., right? What does a turkey do a lot of? Walking. What does a turkey not do a lot of? But they can, but does it not do a lot of? If you want white meat, where do you go? Breasts and things like that, right? So turkeys, you don't see a lot of turkeys flying south for the winter or anything like that. They can fly short bursts and then they have to come down again. So these are going to be like fast glycolytic fibers that are going to be dominating these muscles, whereas the thighs, where they're doing a lot of walking, that's where you're going to find your dark meat, right? More protein technically in that. Okay, so something for you to have with your families and friends in terms of a conversation around the Thanksgiving table. Okay, other things that influence how these different cells can contract. When we looked at it, right, the fiber type, and also what we find is the load, right? So the fiber types we see on either side there, but the load is going to be important too, because if I'm just moving the weight of my forearm, I can do that pretty quickly. Meanwhile, you start putting weights in there, and that's going to slow me down, right? So it's going to be more taxing on the muscle, and it's going to tend to slow me down. Table 9.2 does a good job of showing you all the characteristics of these different fiber types. You definitely should know these different fiber types. What does it mean in terms of slow or fast? What does it mean in terms of oxidative or glycolytic, etc.? And what are they going to be used for? Okay, so like we said, in terms of load, outside of fiber type, if we look at load, the greater the load, right, the more taxing it's going to be on the muscle cell itself. So what we find is, if you look at the graph on the left-hand side here, when we have a heavy load, the amount or distance that's going to be shortened is going to be not very much, whereas a light load, like just your limb, you're going to be able to shorten that muscle quite easily. Imagine like a heavy car or something like that. You may be able to lift it just a little bit, and meanwhile your arm, you should be able to do it pretty well. So the velocity and the distance shortening, if you add more load to it, guess what? It's going to be too taxing, sometimes even too much on the muscle itself. Okay, now here's an interesting thing as well. Remember how we talked about these three fiber types? Well, in fact, with conditioning, with training, you can actually change the distribution of your different muscles in terms of the fiber types. So with more aerobic exercise, right, like biking or running or something like that, you're going to get more capillaries growing into the muscles to deliver oxygen. You're going to get higher mitochondria to make aerobic production of ATP, and you're going to get more myoglobin storing oxygen in the muscles themselves. So more oxygen is better for the giving over, if you will, or creating an environment of oxygen-rich tissues for the aerobic production of ATP, and all of these things makes it so your muscles can perform longer with more strength. Now, if you're doing, like weight training or something like that, weight training, you build up the muscles, but it's very, very short duration. So then instead, you may be converting more to fast glycolytic fibers. And what we find is that there is some ability to convert between these different categories, like from fast glycolytic to fast oxidative fibers, by generating more of these characteristics of molecules and things like that inside of the muscle cells. So you can do some training. The muscle itself in terms of the fiber types can change, but you can actually do some actual conversion of fibers between the types as well. So like we said, in terms of resistance exercise, lifting weights, then what's going to happen is really what you're doing there is you're doing more fast glycolytic. It's typically anaerobic, and your muscles hypertrophy, they get bigger, but realize it's not because we're creating more cells, it's because we're creating more of these individual myofibrils inside of the cells. So that's what actually causes the muscle to get bigger. So when we're talking about actin and myosin, etc., we create a whole bunch more proteins inside of the cell, and the individual cell gets bigger, which means the fascicle gets bigger, which means the muscle itself gets bigger. But likewise, You can build it up, but it can also go away, right? It can hypertrophy to grow up. And then what's the opposite? Atrophy, right? So whether it's in a cast or whether you are just off your training regimen because it's too hot and it's the summer or whatever, these different organs adapt. Okay, so disuse atrophy, like we said, is the loss of mass due to disuse. It can be as much as 5% per day. It's kind of scary. But what we find is that if you can keep conditioning it, you know, if you don't lose too much mass, you can bring it back again. We all know those seasonal changes. Okay, so now we need to finish up with smooth muscle. So all that we're going to do here is we're just going to do some comparisons between smooth muscle and skeletal muscle. So think comparing their anatomy, think comparing their physiology in terms of how they contract and that type of thing. Now you're going to see smooth muscle in all kinds of places around the body, like in the iris of your eye. You can find it along your digestive tract. You can find it in those erector pili muscle in the skin, causing the hairs to stand up. You can find it in your blood vessels, allowing them to constrict and dilate, etc. Walls of most hollow organs except for the heart, because of course the heart has cardiac muscle. And when we look at them, very different in terms of their look, right, in terms of their structure compared to skeletal muscle. So these fibers are tapered. They're kind of pennate shaped like we see here. Unicellular, they have one nucleus per cell, right? And what we find is that they're involuntary, right? You don't have to think about making them contract. And we also find that they can contract longer compared to skeletal muscle. We find they fatigue less. When you see down here in terms of a motor unit and having like one synaptic end bulb on one cell, look, they have these varicosities, lots of different places where we can release our neurotransmitters to stimulate lots of these cells. And these are what are called autonomic nerve fibers, which are part of kind of the autonomic or automatic part of the nervous system, as opposed to our conscious level, if you will, motor neurons instead. The other thing we find, of course, with smooth muscle is that they get their name because they don't have striations. Cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, stripes or striation due to the regular arrangement of our different fibers in there, or I'm sorry, our different myofibrils like actin and myosin, etc. But not so in terms of smooth muscle. Okay. So what we'll find is, like we said, we're going to find smooth muscle in lots of different places. Along the digestive tract, you'll find it going along the digestive tract as well as around the digestive tract, so we can squeeze back and forth or squeeze it along like a toothpaste tube. This word peristalsis, this rhythmic contraction or squeezing of food or other substances through the lumen, is something that we'll talk about when we get to those different systems, but it's provided by or created by smooth muscle in the wall. So we can see it here. A couple different layers, right? So you can see some that goes around the tube, and you can see some that goes along the tube like that. Okay, so some differences. What we find is, again, doesn't have sarcomeres. We don't have that banding pattern. Doesn't have T-tubules and things like that. And what we find is that the calcium still plays an important part, but what we find is it's not all intracellular like in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. A lot of it is extracellular. In addition, the sarcolemma, the plasma membrane, has these foldings that are called calveoli, and calveoli are going to be these areas where we can allow extracellular calcium to come in. So you can see, right, pennate shape, one large nucleus in the center. We can see that we have gap junctions, right? So special cell-to-cell connections, just like in cardiac muscle. And there are the calveoli, right? Those little indentations we see along the edge there. So we're going to allow calcium to come in through a lot of those. Okay, you'll also know this banding, almost like a ribbon-like arrangement here, kind of a diagonal. That's going to be important as well in terms of how these cells contract. Okay, so let's look at how smooth muscle differs from skeletal muscle. So the thick filaments are fewer and have myosin heads along their length. So rather than being a single golf club with a big head up there, imagine if you had a golf club with lots of heads along the length. So that's how it's organized in smooth muscle. Now there's no troponin complex. Now what does that mean to us, right? What's troponin? Troponin is one of our regulatory proteins. Remember, troponin is what binds with calcium to move tropomyosin out of the way, like the parents moving out of the way, to allow the actin and the myosin to come together. There's no troponin complex. Instead, what we have is calmodulin. So calmodulin is associated with tropomyosin and has a similar job, but not troponin. And the thick and thin filaments, rather than being arranged along the fiber, they're arranged diagonally. So it gives it that shape like we were just seeing, that crisscross shape like this. Now they're not arranged enough, with enough regularity, that we can see those stripes or striations. And you notice when it contracts, it doesn't get really, really short. It kind of squishes up almost instead. But that's okay, because it doesn't have to be as forceful as our skeletal muscle, etc. Okay, other things that we see in terms of smooth muscle. Table 9.3 does a good job of comparing our different types of muscle as well. So go through that too. But we're going to look at in terms of the smooth muscle contraction as well. So it's going to be slower. It's going to utilize ATP better. So it takes less ATP and it can contract for longer periods of time. And in fact, it can be self-excitatory. So it can kind of generate its own pace of contraction that we don't have to think about. And that's also similar to cardiac muscle. So it's interesting because skeletal muscle over here, smooth muscle over here, cardiac muscle is kind of in the middle, almost like a hybrid in terms of its anatomy and physiology and how it works. Cardiac muscle also has kind of pacemaker cells, if you will, that can generate its own rhythm. Okay, so like we said, in terms of muscle contraction, sure, we do have actin and myosin. Sure, we do have calcium as a first type of trigger, and ATP is used. But when we look at some of the differences then, what we find is not only is the calcium coming from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but a lot of it comes from the extracellular space. We're using a molecule called calmodulin, not troponin. And there's a different enzyme called myosin kinase. Remember, myo means muscle. ACE tells us we're looking at an enzyme. Myosin kinase is what phosphorylates the myosin head. So, as opposed to, you know, when we were looking at that direct activity of ATP and things like that, so we see an enzyme that's going to be more involved with the actual interaction between myosin and actin, right? So not troponin moving out of the way, it's going to be this calmodulin with myosin kinase allowing those interactions to occur. And then we need to get rid of the calcium, of course. Calcium, we're going to take it into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but we're also going to pump it out of the cell. And we're going to dephosphorylate the myosin in order to get it to detach, if you will. Detach. Okay, so like we said, in terms of, we see some differences, so make sure you pay attention to those differences between skeletal and smooth, both anatomy and physiology. And like we said as well, in terms of ATP use, much more efficient. We don't want our digestive system or our blood vessels tiring out. Then our blood pressure is going to go crazy. We're not going to be able to digest, etc. So mainly aerobic pathways and long duration types of activities. Now in terms of control, we saw with skeletal muscle, it's basically motor neurons, voluntary neurons telling it when to contract. What we get now with smooth muscle is it can be both neural from the autonomic nervous system as well as hormones or even local chemicals telling it when to contract. And some other interesting things about smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, in fact, has a stress relaxation response and can be even more efficient when it is stretched. So imagine, if you will, right? So if you fill your stomach, if your stomach wall was stretched, right, with smooth muscle in it, and if it was skeletal muscle, the skeletal muscle wouldn't work very well. It'd be overstretched and it wouldn't be able to do anything. But smooth muscle can actually adjust. So what it does is it stretches and then it adapts to its new length. And in fact, it can generate more force when it is stretched as opposed to when it's at resting length. So that way, when the stomach is full, as an example, that's the best time to be able to generate force and get it moving, right? As opposed to when it's empty. So that's a special thing about smooth muscle. It's always kind of interesting to me. All right, a couple more things about smooth muscle. Smooth muscle actually occurs in two different types. And again, we're kind of seeing this hybrid in terms of anatomy and physiology. There's what's called unitary smooth muscle and multi-unit smooth muscle. Unitary smooth muscle is also called visceral like guts, and it is found lining the guts, if you will. And what it does is it tends to act as one unit. Think about it that way, one unit. So it's all not individual cells twitching, but basically all acting as one unit. So we can squeeze an area of the intestine and squeeze down the food or whatever. If we get to multi-unit smooth muscle, now instead what we have is almost like skeletal muscle where small groups of muscle cells can act together, right? So you find this like we were talking about the iris of the eye and things like that, as well as like the bronchioles and large arteries, erector pili muscles in the skin. They act a little bit more like skeletal muscle as opposed to this full unitary kind of contracting muscle, smooth muscle, which acts all together. Okay, so just finishing up a couple things of note. Remember when we talked about the development of the muscle, it's going to come from, remember with this word, blasts, right? So these are the active cells, precursor cells, etc. Myoblasts are what are going to be creating all these different muscle cells. And when we talk about skeletal muscle, it takes a whole bunch of these in order to make the multinucleate skeletal muscles. Other things we find with the cardiac and smooth muscle, with the myoblasts, you basically have like 1-to-1. That's why they have one cell. But also when we look in terms of other aspects of it, regeneration of the muscle. Skeletal muscle, really good. Smooth muscle is actually pretty good. Cardiac muscle, not so good. Cardiac muscle has a very limited ability to regenerate. That's why when we talk about people having heart attacks and cardiac muscle cells dying, then that function for that heart or that chamber, etc., is going to be compromised. Now, they found recently that there are small populations of cells that can help to repopulate dead cardiac muscle cells, but they're not going to regenerate much like skeletal or smooth muscle would. Okay. Lastly, one of the things that you might hear about associated with muscle has to do with muscular dystrophy, right? So muscular dystrophy, sometimes you hear about it in telethons and things like that, but muscular dystrophy, is where the muscle itself is replaced by other types of tissues like fat and connective tissue, and then the muscle tissue itself basically goes away. And there is different types of muscular dystrophy. The most common type is DMD, and this one is a sex-linked trait, and what happens is there's a defective gene they call dystrophin that then causes this muscular degeneration and replacement by other tissues. So you can imagine these people get weaker and weaker through time. Okay, so sorry that was a little bit longer, but we did get all the way through our muscular tissue chapter. So the next time we meet, we'll be talking about it on a larger scale instead. We'll talk about those skeletal muscles, we'll talk about where they are and what they look like, how they're classified, what they do, etc. We'll get up to the organ level again, since we've been down here at the molecular and cellular and tissue level for quite a while. So you can come up and get kind of a breath using some of your different muscles.